Tudor news is back, and we've got an extremely interesting discovery to discuss. Don't worry about where I've been. Tired. Or what I've been doing. Tired. Or, you know, how I'm feeling. I'm extremely chronically tired. I'm fine. As I have said in videos past, the UK aristocracy have a considerable access to private archives of material. I'm talking letters, I'm talking diaries, I'm talking artworks, I'm talking portraits that are, in my opinion, considerably under-researched. There could be unknowable treasures locked away that just aren't available for public research and enjoyment. This brings us to a new portrait, well, semi-new, that could be truly extraordinary, a real potential once-in-a-lifetime discovery-ish. This may be potentially the only surviving contemporary image of the tragically fated 9-day queen, Lady Jane Grey. I've long been fascinated by the idea that there is this magical lost portrait of Lady Jane Grey. So Mary Lovell, in her excellent biography of Bess of Hardwicke, mentions that Bess kept a portrait of Jane Grey in her bedchamber right up until her death. So that the two had been friends in youth, and Bess, through marriage, became a pseudo-relative, and it's this glimpse of this deeply personal indication of grief that highlights the humanity for a figure that has essentially gained a folkloric element, that she is this mythical story of innocence lost and the ruthlessness of power. And I just wanted to know what happened to this picture over the centuries and the others like it that must have existed, the countless treasures lost to the unrelenting nature of time and deliberate malice. Lady Jane Grey is one of the more tragic figures of the Tudor period, which is saying something because a lot of awful things happened to an awful lot of people in this time, and an exceptionally unlucky victim of circumstance. I previously covered the deeply interconnected nature of the Tudor royal family in my video covering the discovery of the cabinet portrait of Arbella Stuart, and Jane Grey was featured on that family tree. Jane Grey had an illustrious pedigree as a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, granddaughter of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, great-niece of Henry VIII, and first cousin once removed to Edward VI, Mary I, and good old Lizzie I. And as named in the final act of succession as passed by Henry VIII in 1544, a potential heir to the English throne. If all of Henry's children died without leaving descendants, I perish the thought, the crown would pass to the heirs of his youngest sister, that being Jane and her sisters Catherine and Mary. No one was actually expecting this to happen. I mean, what are the odds of 3 people having not a single child between them? I mean, come on, really? I mean, like, that's just, the odds on that, the bit has outstayed its welcome. But as Edward VI contracted a respiratory disease, which was most likely tuberculosis, in 1553, it soon became clear to himself and the innermost circles of his court that his time was rapidly running out. He was dying. What the timescale on that was, no one quite knew, but it was a-coming. This left him with a weensy bit of a problem. His next presumptive heir was his elder half-sister Mary, who was a die-hard Roman Catholic opposed to the Edwardian Reformation, making the English Church far more Protestant in nature. Well, so you would think, like, okay, Edward, you can go on to your next half-sister, Elizabeth, who, unfortunately, is also a woman, and while she is Protestant, Edward's personal religious philosophy was opposed to the idea of women being in charge and women holding positions of governance. He could not stretch his mind to imagining either of his sisters ruling the country after him. Instead, he decided to illegally contravene his father's legislation and named the heirs male of his young, Protestant, recently married first cousin, who was definitely sure to have a son by the time Edward was dead. I mean, like, what are the odds that this teenage girl is not going to have a son by the time that I am dead? Well, unfortunately, as Edward's illness developed far more rapidly than expected, he was forced to make a hasty alteration to his will, declaring his true and legal heir as the Lady Jane Grey, and her heirs male before promptly dying on the 6th of July 1553. Jane, who had not been aware of any of this, was summoned to London and bullied into accepting. Keeping the death of Edward on the down low, they sort of kept it secret until the 10th of July when they suddenly said, hey, he's dead, and this is our new queen, Jane Grey. She's Queen of England, France and Ireland. Isn't that great? And everyone said, who? In a world without the breathless reporting of Hello Magazine and drama Reddit posts, the subjects of England didn't know the ins and outs of minor royal relatives and had no idea who Jane Grey was. What they did know was two things. A, Jane Grey was, coincidentally married to the son of the Duke of Northumberland. The Duke of Northumberland being Edward's Lord Protector, pseudo-regent, and a man who stood to gain an awful lot to being the father-in-law of an underage queen, and B, that this act trampled over the rights of Henry's natural-born daughters. Mary, naturally by right and by law, should be queen, and they were going to enforce it. Both nobility and common folk rallied to Mary's cause. She gathered a huge army of volunteers, retainers, the artillery of the Royal Navy to march on London. Meanwhile, in the background, influential members of the Privy Council orchestrated a coup behind the Duke of Northumberland's back. With little support and no means of defending Jane's claim, councillors met on the 19th of July to formally declare that this was all a huge misunderstanding. Jane's claim is over. Mary is Queen of England, just as she should be. Jane's rule was officially over, having only lasted 9 days, although technically around 13 if we count from when Edward actually died. Jane and her husband Guildford were imprisoned in the Tower of London, with Mary initially deciding to spare their lives, seeing quite rightly, reasonable thinking from a Tudor monarch, that they were pawns being used in the political games of others. However, this all changed when the Spanish struck. Mary had initially avoided being too overtly Catholic to make sure that she had a wide spectrum of support. However, at the start of 1554, she decided to marry her Catholic cousin Philip of Spain, a move that would bring England back into the sphere of Catholic Europe and back under papal authority once more. This was not a popular move. Rebellions were sparked in the name of overthrowing her in favour of her sister Elizabeth. We've already overthrown one false Queen Mary. We'll do it again. Jane was not the focus of these revolts. She had nothing to do with them. They were not attempting just a switchback. But as her father and Guildford's brothers joined in, it just made it clear to Mary's government that they were too dangerous as potential figureheads to be left alive. And while their deaths troubled Mary, she had no problem in signing the orders for their execution on the 19th of January 1554. Those Tudors, they nevertheless let their personal convictions get in the way of getting rid of their enemies. The teenagers were executed on the 12th of February. Guildford was killed first, as Jane watched. What a horrible thing! Before she too was brought to Tower Green. According to the Chronicle of Queen Jane and of 2 years of Queen Mary, Jane gave a short speech as she climbed on the scaffold. Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same. The fact, indeed, against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me, but touching the procurement and desire thereof by me, or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency before God, and the face of you Christian people, this day. The executioner, as per tradition, asked for her forgiveness. She willingly gave this and begged him that her death be quick, before asking whether he would decapitate her before she had the chance to lay down properly. She blindfolded herself, but in the process lost track of her surroundings. With her hands stretched out, she tried to desperately find the block, crying out in fear. She was assisted to the correct position, laying her head on the block, whispering, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," before her head was struck off. This act was disliked by everybody. It did not help Mary. It did not make her popular. It did not make her government popular. Jane Grey quickly became a tragic and romantic figure, proclaimed as a martyr by Protestants 5 months after her death. Scholarly, innocent, pious, resigned to her fate, unsullied by the world around her, a figure of unparalleled quality and victimhood. Jane Grey has been used as the inspiration for ballads, plays, operas and art for centuries, being the perfect metaphor for the inherent corruption of man when presented with ultimate power. And in an extra twist, we have no contemporary images of Jane. We have very little connected to her as the person. Her youth and her relative obscurity has led art historians to believe that there may have been no formal portraits of her when she was alive, or at the very least, the few that may have been created have not survived. Like Anne Boleyn, she is another frequent contender in the classic game, who is this funky portrait trying to be? With varying results. After all, there's the classic supposed Jane Grey image, which is now known to be Catherine Parr, the potential of the Beaufort miniature, and the chef's kiss all-time wretched portrait winner, the Streatham portrait. So, as the Streatham portrait leads us to my main point. This portrait is an oil painting from the late 16th century, and it's believed to be a copy of an earlier image of Lady Jane Grey. We've seen this before. Artists using well-known or well-proliferated images of important dignitaries to create commercial copies for sale. The painting shows a young woman of the 1550s holding a prayer book with the inscription Lady Jane in the upper left corner. Okay, this is a complete tangent, but I had to bring it up because of the actions of a certain David Kostakis, aka Mr. David Starkey. So, Starkey has worked in the identification game before, so he's responsible for the re-identification of the Catherine Parr portrait, and he has made numerous attempts at shredding Foley's analysis. His arguments against it include the fact that it doesn't have the over-the-top quality of royal portraits where the sitters look as though they've just come back from Asprey, ignoring the fact that Lady Jane Grey was a very minor royal, and that if the National Portrait Gallery has public money to burn, then so be it. The decision depends on mere hearsay and tradition, and it is not good enough.
I'm not gagging.
Foley responded that the evidence has been supported by people who know far more about the science of painting than David Starkey. I don't know what his problem is. Is it because he didn't find it?
Wait. It's no tea. It's no tea. Like... wait.
Ripping the piss out of David Starkey aside, although Lord knows he deserves it, what makes the Streatham portrait interesting is the damage it has sustained. There is significant damage to the face of the young woman depicted. 17 long scratches over her mouth and eyes committed not long after the portrait was completed. Why would someone be inspired to attack a portrait of an innocuous young woman? Perhaps because they represented a partisan political or religious position? Because they'd been killed as a traitor? Because their image had once been too dangerous to own? The damage is nearly identical to this portrait, the property of a private collection but now currently on display at Rest Park, a former residence of the Grey family. This image has also had her eyes, mouth and ears deliberately scratched out, a symbolic, humiliating act of violence. But we're not here just to discuss the significance of iconoclastic damage. Why do English Heritage and the Courtnall Institute of Art believe this could be a long-lost image of Jane Grey? What other evidence do they have? Fashion-wise, this woman is dead on for the late 1540s, early 1550s. Women's fashion had moved from the wide, natural waisted shapes of the 1520s and 1530s to a stiffer, more rigid shape. So we're seeing these long train dragging skirts becoming shorter, they're going to the ground, there's a distinct silhouette with a lowered waist, gives this illusion of this narrow, tiny shape with a cone-shaped farthingale, waist girdles and the use of funnel sleeves. There was also a trend for closed gowns that fitted across the shoulders using these flared, standing chemise collars that are highly decorated and contrasted to the main fabric of the bodice and skirt. Her headdress is not a typical hood-style covering, but it does appear to be a wide coif, which is known in mid-century and later Tudor England, which does bear stylistic similarities to the English hood, where you have the crown relatively flat over the head before widening at the sides at an angle over the ears. However, infrared scanning has shown that there has been changes made to the costume after the portrait was finished. The sleeves were altered, obscuring their shape and wider decorations, and this white scarf that is not quite like a covering, it was added, I'm not quite sure what it is. She was also potentially depicted with a more distinctive and decorated hood with a veil over her left shoulder, but it's not quite clear enough to say for sure. So her clothes fit the time frame, but is there any other evidence? Well, there is the painting itself. It's painted on a wooden board, common enough in the time period, and they have analysed the tree rings of the wood. So it's made from Baltic oak. The tree rings tell us that it was most likely cut and shaped between 1539 and 1571, which does fit. The back of the panel, perhaps more conclusively, displays a cargo mark that is identical to one that is used in the royal portraits of Edward VI, which creates a direct link between this portrait and the royal court. And there is a limited pool of women who fit the right age bracket, who are around in the 1540s and 1550s, who have connections to Edward and his court, and who might have inspired acts of symbolic violence. Peter Moore, the curator for English Heritage at Wrest Park, has noted how the painting was originally purchased by Anthony Grey, 11th Earl of Kent in 1701, under the assumption that it depicted his ancestor Jane Grey. Moore has said, "It is thrilling to have this painting back at Wrest, and new research provides tantalising evidence which brings us much closer to the assertion that it could be Lady Jane Grey." Now, as is the Norman Tudor research, this identification has not gone without criticism. Pew, 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 pew. J. Stephen Edwards, a noted independent historian who specialises in the images and icons of Jane Grey, has previously argued that the portrait actually depicts Mary, Lady Dacre, a descendant of the Woodvilles and distant cousin to Henry VIII, and a figure in Tudor court in her own right, while rightfully pointing out that none of us can properly come to any definitive conclusion this far removed from the creation of the portrait. He doesn't think that the supposed new evidence is particularly strong. He cites there's a serious lack of recorded provenance, which is fair, and that the sitter, her clothing just is incorrect. To be precise, her jewellery, or rather her lack of it, that the sitter is dressed simply with this single pendant and string of pearls suggests she is of the lower classes perhaps, as this not befitting royalty, as this idea of a modest, meek Protestant princess is a creation of culture, not reflecting the lived reality of a 16th century woman of royal rank, and that the tree ring evidence doesn't really add anything to the debate, as it was already believed that the image was created in the 1540s or the 1550s. He is sticking to his stated position that it's Lady Dacre. How surprising. Although his position on her clothing doesn't ring true with me. Lady Dacre was also a woman with a position at court, significant enough to be part of Anne of Cleves' welcoming party and to take part in the funeral of Mary I. She would also be depicted richly, bejewelled, as reflective of her status and her distant royal heritage. There's also the fact that we have identified portraits of Lady Dacre, and to me, she does not bear any similarity to the woman in the Wrest Park portrait. They have very differently shaped faces, their noses are different, and they have significantly different builds. Lady Dacre she's a big lady. She's a plus-sized woman. Her body shape is quite different to the younger woman in the Wrest Park portrait. To me, they do not look anything alike. What do I personally believe? Well, I think there's compelling evidence that this is a portrait that can be dated to within Jane Grey's life, that the sitter is of a correct age, her clothing is correct, and it could have possible links to Edward VI's court. The vandalisation is unusual, and it's hard to think of other young women during this period who might have been targets of such visceral hatred. Looking at supposed Jane Grey portraits, I have personally noted there are iconographic elements that are similar in the Rest Park portrait to the Norris, Houghton and Streatham portraits. That the women are facing left, they've got this pot chemise collar, loose gown with wide sleeves, they're all holding prayer books, which is enough to suggest perhaps a shared reference to a lost image, or at least one that was popularly known. We can tell if it's Henry VIII or Lizzie by the common symbols that are used in their imagery, so the fact that all these portraits have these elements suggests a contemporaneous cultural idea of Jane Grey. In that case, these would be portraits created to meet purchaser needs, to create an accepted image of Jane Grey, to fit this cultural understanding of her as this devout, stoic, scholarly, modest Protestant martyr, rather than being anywhere close to being an accurate representation of how she may have presented and what she looked like. I do agree there are significant problems with the provenance. I mean, surely a member of the Grey family is going to buy any portrait that you say is Jane Grey, especially in 1701, before art historian provenance, and there's a lot of janky 17th century portraits. And as with so many of these, it's impossible to conclusively state who this woman might be, but she does fulfill what we desire to see. We want to know Lady Jane Grey, to look into her face and see a girl who was forced into an unwinnable position, destined to die purely because of a heritage she had no choice or control over. We want her to be reclaimed, to be found and not anonymous anymore, to be a young woman of courage and dignity when facing her fate. And this portrait does provide that, whether or not it's actually Jane herself.